You're listening to another podcast. A podcast not only of reviewing and discussing, but of discovery. A deep dive into a classic show whose influence is immeasurable. Your next stop? Anthology. Hello and welcome to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. I'm your host, Matt Hurt, and if this is your first time listening, Anthology is a podcast where I reviewed The Twilight Zone as a first-time viewer and other classic and contemporary science fiction anthology series. For archives of all of my episodes, visit AnthologyPod.com. You can also like the Facebook page at Facebook.com/AnthologyPod and follow me on Twitter at OVAnthologyPod. And while all of these episodes will always be free forever, if you'd like to support what I do here, you can become a patron at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer, where you can get access to tons and tons and tons of exclusive B-roll episodes, TV and book reviews, movie reaction recordings, commentary tracks, early access to podcast episodes, and previously unreleased content. There is a ton of stuff there. I have a bunch of different reward tiers there. So if you sign up at the $1 level, you get early access to content plus B-roll episodes, which is just me and my co-hosts and friends kind of farting around and discussing a variety of topics. But if you sign up at the $2 level, you get that plus book and TV reviews and reaction recordings. Right now I'm doing an episode by episode review series on Apple TV Plus's Severance Season 1, which I am absolutely adoring. It is right, if you're into science fiction, it's right up your alley there. I also do Stephen King book reviews and everything on there. So those are just the first two levels. At the $5 level, you get movie reaction recordings and movie potpourri episodes. So I've been doing these sci-fi duos potpourri things on Patreon for the $5 level. So I did a review of Duel and After Yang, and then I did a review of Cube and Identity, and next up I'm going to be doing a review of Close Encounters of the Third Kind and The Vast of Night. So I have a whole roadmap for that. But anyway, all of that is available at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. You get a recurring monthly charge at the beginning of each month. When you sign up for it, you get charged immediately and you get immediate access to everything on there. So if you have the means and want to hear more of me talking about stuff that I like, check out patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. It's actually a huge, huge help to me because there is a lot of work that goes into putting out three different podcasts and plus Patreon. So anyway, if you have the means, check it out, patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. So today on Anthology, I'm going to be discussing Nothing in the Dark, which is the 16th episode of The Twilight Zone's third season, which originally aired on January 5th, 1962. And as usual, I will be rounding out the episode with a brief, non-spoiler review of Science Fiction Theater Season 1, Episode 24, Dead Storage. So we've got a bit of stuff to handle today, and we've got a bunch of stuff to handle today, and like in my notes, I was just about to get into the plot summary courtesy of Twilight Zone Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic. But two things. One, I switched around my notes, so now I'm going to do what I knew before I do the plot summary. But also my plot summary, I have a picture of the plot summary from the book, but it's cut off in the PDF that I have. So anyway, so before I get into the actual episode and everything, I do want to mention that, like I said, I've been doing Patreon reviews for Severance, and it's really fun. But I also, in preparation for some book review stuff that I'm going to do on Patreon, I picked up a new a collection at Half Price Books the other day, which I'm just really excited about because it looks freaking gorgeous. It is the classic H.G. Wells collection. It's a very colorful kind of pulp sci-fi slipcase, and then each book is paperback with different color schemes and different, like I said, kind of pulp cover art on it. It looks absolutely gorgeous, and Basically, it's The Time Machine and Other Stories. So The Time Machine and some short stories. And then I've also got The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, and The First Men in the Moon. So I'm very excited to dig into to these books and then throw some stuff up on Patreon for it. But I'm just really excited because it looks so freaking cool. And like, it's July 20-something, 24th, I think. And like, there's about a month or so left of summer, and I'm really excited to like kind of sit by the pool and read some H.G. Wells. So anyway, I'm really excited about that. Anyway, so let me go into what I knew about Nothing in the Dark before I watched it for the first time. So on my notes I have, I'm not sure. All I knew was that it had Robert Redford in it, and it had something to do with an old woman, and that's based solely on what my eyes kind of brushed over on the Wikipedia page when I was trying to get my notes and everything together before I watched it. The title, Nothing in the Dark, really made me wonder if it might have been something similar to The Midnight Sun, maybe something about an abnormal or uncontrollable weather phenomenon. And then also the kind of still image that is associated with this episode that has Robert Redford standing and kind of beckoning Wanda toward him. That made me think that it had something to do with like a biker gang in a weird way. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever, but yeah, I think that I had, because he's dressed in black and he's in a police uniform, but in the picture I didn't really notice that or anything, but he, it kind of, I think maybe I got it confused with, what is it? Black Leather Jackets, I think is an episode that's going to be in the series. I don't know. But anyway, that's what I kind of thought the episode was beforehand, had no idea. So, having said that, let me go into the plot summary, courtesy of the Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic by Martin Grams Jr. And just so you guys know, I'm going to be spoiling Nothing in the Dark from here on out, so fair warning. If you haven't watched the episode, go watch it, come back, and listen to my review. So here we go. Plot summary of Nothing in the Dark. A police officer is shot and wounded outside the front door of an abandoned tenement where a frightened old woman resides. Against her better judgment, she pulls the young man in and nurses his wounds, even fixing him warm tea. She has no telephone to call a doctor. She explains to the young man that Mr. Death is out there, waiting for the opportunity to take her away. In fear of her life, she has spent the last few years fending off people whom she feared was Mr. Death in disguise. Late that afternoon, a city contractor barges into her place to inform her that she has to leave. The building has been condemned, and his job is to tear down the old to make room for the new. The contractor leaves, warning her she has just 1 hour to pack her belongings. Before she can decide what to do, she discovers that her guest went unseen by the contractor, because the young officer is Death himself. In an attempt to reassure her that the running is over, he gains her confidence and takes her by the hand. Looking down at her frail, cold body, her fears are put aside. What she thought would come like an explosion comes in a whisper. And in the afterlife, she has an incredible journey ahead. So, starring as Wanda Dunn in this episode is Gladys Cooper, making her first of 3 Twilight Zone appearances. The next we'll see from her is in Season 4's Passage on the Lady Anne, and some other credits that she had in over the course of her career were for My Fair Lady, Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, which if you're in Indianapolis, I think that's going to be playing at Keystone Art next month or at the Can Theater. The Can Theater in Indianapolis and Keystone Art are doing Alfred Hitchcock birthday kind of celebrations things throughout October, and even or not October but August. I already saw Rear Window at the Can, and it was amazing. That movie is absolutely stunning. And then another credit of Gladys Cooper is one episode of The Outer Limits in 1963 titled The Borderland. And co-starring as Harold Belden, slash death is Robert Redford, who is, of course, a legendary actor and director. He won Best Director at the Oscars for Ordinary People. His credits are vast and include Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, All the President's Men, The Natural, The Sting, some of the Marvel movies, and he's legendary. This was his only episode of the Twilight Zone, though, and although he did appear in a 1960 Playhouse 90 episode that was written by Serling called In the Presence of Mine Enemies, which sounds like really intense. That episode is about a Jewish man in the Warsaw Ghetto who plots revenge against the German officer who raped his wife, I believe. So pretty intense. And then rounding out the cast as the contractor is R.G. Armstrong. This was his only episode of The Twilight Zone, but some of his other credits included Predator, Children of the Corn, Dick Tracy, and he was also in 5 episodes of the short-lived X-Files spinoff Millennium. And in terms of the sci-fi anthology realm, he was in 1 episode of Tales of the Unexpected in 1977. And writer for this episode was George Clayton Johnson. This is his 5th of 7 Twilight Zone episodes. We previously saw his work in A Game of Pool, and next we'll see from him is, in the upcoming episode, Kick the Can. And rounding out the talent rundown is director Lamont Johnson, who makes his 3rd directorial effort out of his 8 total Twilight Zone episodes. Previously, we saw his work in, just a couple of weeks ago, in 5 Characters in Search of an Exit. Or was that last episode? No, that wasn't last episode. What was last episode? I don't remember. Anyway, actually, that's going to really bother me. Because there's no way he did 3 consecutive episodes. Although, there's a piece of trivia here about this episode. So anyway, Quality of Mercy was last week. Sorry. Okay, so yeah, he did 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, and then next we'll see from him is actually next week's episode, One More Pallbearer. I do have some trivia. I just have 1 piece of trivia, but I'm going to say that up front now because I usually wait until the end of the episode to the end of my review. But since I only have 1 piece of trivia and it kind of ties into the episode itself, I am going to go ahead and share my piece of trivia now. So the piece of trivia I have is that this episode was actually it was filmed in 1961, in April or May 1961, and it was originally going to be the season finale of season 2, but it was kind of it was shelved and replaced by The Obsolete Man. There was, according to Martin Grams Jr., there was like a memo or something that Buck Houghton wrote that said that the reason behind that was that they wanted to have a couple of episodes kind of banked for season 3 so that they could really come out swinging when season 3 went into production. So as such, this episode is kind of interesting because when you watch it, it does not have the opening title and credits and everything. Like, it doesn't have the title screen that comes up after Serling's monologue or after his opening narration. It just goes into just the episode, like the seasons 1 and 2 episodes did. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and it was funny because like I had read that piece of trivia, like I knew that was the case. And then, like, I watched this episode several times, and I was, after like the 3rd time, I was like, wait, I didn't see the title. Like, why didn't they do that? And it took me like a few minutes to realize, oh, it's because this was originally shot for season 2. So anyway, let me get into my review of Nothing in the Dark. And so we open on this very kind of, it's this really interesting, nicely detailed set of this tenement apartment where it seems like it's a little run down. There's a lot of disheveled things in the space. And we see that the windows are boarded up, and we open on it and we see, or we hear rather, people outside. We hear at least one person outside, and we see that the snow is falling, so we know that it's kind of winter time, it's cold. Which also, like, my running thing throughout this review that I'm going to try to be a little bit, level with, is that this episode is really bleak. For as uplifting and hopeful as it is at the end, or positive as it is at the end, it's really bleak to me. And I'll try to kind of go into detail as I go through the review. But a bit of bleakness for that is the fact that, like, we find out later in the episode that the building is about to be demolished, and that the gas man has come previously to that. She is like out an hour away from losing her home. And so she must not have any power. Like, she must not have any electricity, any like air conditioning, nothing. She must have nothing in there, because, I mean, if that's the day that they're demolishing it. So just the thought that, like, okay, the windows are boarded up, there's breaking glass outside. I don't know if there's it can't be that well insulated, but with it snowing outside, just this poor old woman is just kind of sitting in this apartment, presumably freezing. It's really kind of sad and depressing. So anyway, we see Wanda. She's asleep in bed, and like, at first I thought that someone broke the window and was trying to get in, and my immediate thought was like, wow, that is actually horrifying. Like, that idea of an isolated person alone having someone attempt to break into her home. But that wasn't the case. I think that it was just crunching glass from the man outside, which I think was Harold. But I couldn't really tell. It didn't really make much sense. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter, because all of it's a ruse by Death anyway. Like, he's just getting things into position to where he can get Wanda to let him in and allow him to coerce her into dying. So, like I said, the set design is really nice and really well done. This is basically a bottle episode. There's really just one location. There is only one location. We never go outside of the apartment. And just the detail of it is really well done and pretty cool. And there's also like this frequency of showing Wanda behind bars, like behind the bars of her bedpost. And I think that that's really interesting. Like, there are multiple times in the episode where she is either the shadow of the almost crib-like bed, but the shadow of the bars are kind of crossing over her face, or toward the end when she's talking to the contractor, like, she's literally like holding her hands like it's a prison, like it's a jail, and she has her head kind of like in between two of the slats. Very, very interesting and evocative of the fact that she's in a prison of her own fear and paranoia. As kind of hokey and weird as that would sound, it's true. Like, she is a victim of her own fear and her own unwillingness to confront her mortality. And I just thought that was a really interesting kind of visual metaphor. So, at this point, I see that the man is standing outside. It's weird because, like, I presume that it's Harold, because he has, like, a police officer's cap, but that cap goes away completely. It's nowhere to be found in the rest of the episode. And he's kind of like crouching and then kind of popping back up. I didn't really know what was going on, because we don't see any other person. And so Wanda goes up to the door and then kind of relaxes. And when she relaxes, that's when we hear the whistle, like the policeman whistle, and gunfire. And then we hear him crumple in front of the door. We also hear a car screeching off in the distance, so the gunman has left. Which of course none of that matters because it's not real. So, which isn't a criticism or anything. I'm just saying, like, I'm not going to bother thinking too hard about it because it doesn't really have a bearing on the plot as far as, the actual plot element of it is concerned. It just has this, it's all circumstance to get Death in the door. So, Harold is moaning and yelling that he's a policeman and that he's shot and he needs help. And she says through the door that he's lying, and that she knows who he is and what he is. And it's really interesting to me upon repeat viewings of this episode, because he's taking on this persona of an injured and dying man so that she can relate to him. Like, I don't think he actually says the words, but basically the underlying thing with everything that he says is, I don't want to die. Like, I don't think he actually says that, but she says that about herself several times through the episode. So the kind of inference of him, dying literally on death's door, is to kind of coerce her into letting him in and getting her into position to accept his hand so that she can go into the afterlife, because he is under this kind of persona, or he's doing this performance of someone who doesn't want to die, who's someone that she can relate to. So that's kind of interesting. Again, before we get to the opening narration, though, I've got to say, this is such a strangely depressing and dark episode for me, and I'm really going to try my best to explain as I go through it, but it is so bleak to me in a weird way, and it is in such contrast to the uplifting ending. So like I said, I'm going to try my best to really kind of parse out my thoughts there, but just kind of keep in mind, this is a pretty dark episode, in my opinion, and I'm excited to really dig into it. But for now, here is Rod Serling's opening narration for Nothing in the Dark.
An old woman living in a nightmare. An old woman who has fought 1,000 battles with death and always won. Now she's faced with a grim decision, whether or not to open a door. And in some strange and frightening way, she knows that this seemingly ordinary door leads to the Twilight Zone.
All right, so what I kind of learned from that is that the woman is faced with the choice of opening the door and helping the man live or letting him die. Which I thought that was going to kind of be the prevailing, I thought that was going to be kind of the prevailing thing about the episode, the prevailing, I don't know, the kind of prevailing theme of the episode, because I kind of thought that it was all about her paranoia. I thought that it was going to be all about her paranoia, and that I thought that it was going to reveal that there was an alien invasion or something like that, some reason for her to distrust all of humanity. There's not, and that's fine. But I also thought that it was about prejudices as well. That's what I thought it was going to be about. But alas, it is about the fear of the unknown and fear of death, fear of mortality, aging, all of that. And it's really fascinating to me how the episode makes Death the most compassionate character in the entire episode. And it's using the character and the concept of death and a specter of death as a vessel for the afterlife rather than a grim reaper. And I find that to be really interesting, in contrast to just the absolute darkness of the character of Wanda, which I'll talk about, I promise, but it's so bleak and depressing to me. So anyway, we come back from the opening narration. She opens the door with the chain on, and we see Robert Redford laying in the snow, saying, "Unless you help me, I'm going to die." He's groaning in pain. And Wanda says, "Don't say that. It isn't fair. You're trying to trick me." And I find that really interesting because the distrust is interesting since she's right. She's absolutely right. He is trying to trick her. But on the other hand, he's not trying to trick her in order to kill her in like a malicious way, which is a weird thing to say. Like, yeah, he's not trying to kill her in a malicious way. He's just trying to kill her. But no, he's not deceiving her to get her to die prematurely, is how I would say it. He's trying to trick her in order to gain her trust and convince her to come around to the idea of dying, and to make her understand that death isn't the end and that there's something more and that it is her time. And I find that to be a really interesting way of kind of delving into the whole Death thing. Like, Death is a character that's been in the Twilight Zone in the first half of the series numerous times, and with varying in various ways. But here is just, and most notably Murray Hamilton in One for the Angels. But this is slightly, I don't know, it's different because it delves more into the human aspect of it, the human condition of facing your mortality. And it would be easy to kind of write it off as, well, she's old, she should die. Like, that's not to sound crass or anything or sound like too negative, but like, it would be easy to write it off as her ignoring the fact that it's her time, rather than it exploring the actual overall themes of, of it being your time and of, living your life, which is, again, what I'm going to kind of get into in terms of the bleakness of the episode, but that's for here in a little bit. But basically, we get Robert Redford says his name is Harry Belden. He's a police officer. He's been shot. He's injured. He's going to die if she doesn't help. And there's this really cool camera technique. We have Wanda opening the door, but having the chain on. So it's just opened a crack. And as Harold is kind of pleading with her, the camera zooms in through that entrance, through the very, very small entrance of the door that we can see through, into a close-up on Robert Redford. And I just thought that was a really cool just camera movement. I thought it was really good. So he asks her to call a doctor. She says that she doesn't have a phone. And then she says, I'd have to unlock the door. You can't ask me to do that. I don't want to die. Which, honestly, like, seeing this in 2022, it kind of resonates in a weird, twisted way with 2020 and COVID lockdowns and not being able to leave and not without fear of, potentially catching a highly transmissible virus that we weren't prepared for, really. So that kind of resonated in a little way, like very, very lightly. But yeah, so anyway, he continues groaning and begging her to let him in. And he says in this weird, like, kind of full of compassion way, like, I don't understand why you're going to let me die. And it's not in any sort of angry way. It still has that kind of calm and cool compassion at it. And like, I haven't said this yet, but I love Robert Redford's performance in this episode. It is absolutely fantastic. As well as Gladys Cooper, I think was her name. I'm scrolling up and then I'm going to lose my spot in my notes. Yeah, Gladys Cooper. So anyway, I love the kind of two-hander aspect of the episode between these two performers is really, really fantastic. And Robert Redford is so charming and disarming. And I think that is a brilliant performance given the character as being Death. And it's really interesting. So she decides, she says that it isn't fair to her, but she unlocks the door and opens it and lets him in. And then we get kind of, I think at that point, do we get a cut to commercial? I think so. And then we see that, Harold passes out and she touches him and realizes she's still alive. And here's where I think the more gloomy aspect of the episode kind of resides. She touches him and realizes she's still alive, which means that he's not Death. In her eyes, obviously he is, but in her eyes, it means that he's not Death and that he's safe. So she brings him into the home. And so there, like that's what it is. That's what that episode or what that moment is all about. But to kind of dig a little bit deeper into it, it is a little bit bleak for me and kind of depressing because this is a woman who has avoided human contact for years. And in doing so, she is living a lonely existence. She is living this isolated, completely alone, free from like human interaction, because she is afraid that death is at every corner. She's afraid that death is coming after her. It's a really interesting concept, and I'm not saying this to criticize the episode. I'm just saying that this is a very bleak episode by all accounts. But she... In this moment, she kneels down and touches Harold and realizes she isn't dead. And that is first, it's a big step for her because it is completely out of the norm for her. It's completely unsafe of her to do that in her eyes. But it's bleak and depressing because there's this slight hopefulness in that moment. Like she has this hope in her that like, oh, maybe everything isn't so bad. Maybe death isn't after me, or maybe even though he's not death, maybe that means that it's not at every corner. And it's depressing because Wanda was kind of wasting her life hiding from death. And it's just this moment of experiencing human connection, just a physical human touch, and it not killing her is really depressing because she has wasted years of her life hiding away. So that, I don't know, that's kind of that's kind of a bleak read of it. But then on the other hand, the kind of depiction of death as a compassionate entity in this episode is really, it kind of counterbalances that underscored or undercurrent of bleakness, because in that moment he didn't take her. He is death, but he did not take her when he clearly could have. But he didn't take her in that moment because he wanted her to understand. He wanted to bring her to the moment where she makes the choice to die, which I think is really, really interesting and fascinating. Like I said earlier in the episode, it is indicative of, like, it's showing death as a compassionate figure instead of like a grim reaper. And I just find that to be really, really satisfying. So she brings him into the house, and my immediate thought, as a huge Stephen King fan, I thought, is she going to misery him? Because like at that point I didn't know that it had anything to do with death or the specter of death or anything. So I kind of thought that this was going to be like one of the things that laid the groundwork for Stephen King to write Misery. But it's not. So basically I was thinking that it was going to be similar to The Howling Man, but it's more like One for the Angels, which is fine. So as she is kind of nursing him back to health, we see that Harold is feeling better and says that the doctor is going to come and then he'll be out of her hair. And again, this is another aspect of the episode that makes it pretty depressing for me, because he has that moment where he's like, you didn't call the doctor. And she said, no, there's no one, like, I don't have a phone. Everyone else has moved away and everything. I can't leave. I can't call the doctor. But what is depressing about it, what makes it very bleak to me, is that Wanda is seemingly great at taking care of Harold. She has nursed him back to health. Granted, it's, he's death. He's putting on a show. He's probably, it probably wasn't her doing and everything, but in the context of the episode, she is great at taking care of him, and she gives him tea, she gives him food, she's taking care of him. And it gives this impression that when she's in the company of people, she has purpose and she's driven and everything. And it's something that she's been lacking for many years at this point, specifically because she has been waiting and evading death at every turn. So because she's been evading death, she hasn't had a chance to interact with people or have people over or take care of people. And it makes the episode slightly tragic without making the source of that tragedy a direct lesson in the episode, which is something I'm kind of struggling to kind of resolve in my brain a little bit. So So anyway, she says that she can't take the chance of letting in anyone else, like letting in the doctor, which again, felt like it was going to be a captive story. But she goes on to say that it's because she's afraid of death. She's afraid of Mr. Death. And she says everyone she meets, she fears, is death. And that I find really interesting as well. Like, I was kind of like, okay, this is where it's going. This is definitely satisfying to me. So she talks about how, like last week, Death came to the door and said he was from the gas company. Next, he was a contractor with the city. She's saying all of these people that are coming to the house specifically to tell her to leave because they are going to demolish the building. And I found that to be really interesting because she has this delusion that death is around every corner, and that delusion is clouding her from the truth of the impending loss of her home. And I don't know, it kind of feels like that her obsession with hiding from death is like maybe actually a defense mechanism to not confront the fact that she's losing her home and everything is about to change for her. Of course, her obsession with death predates the condemning of her home and everything, but I kind of feel like it's still worth noting that Wanda is so focused on escaping death that she can't help that she's so focused on escaping death that she can't confront the very real situation that she's facing. And I kind of think that would have been an interesting angle for the episode to explore, except for it being just the exact same kind of ending as One for the Angels. It's about death taking taking the protagonist of the episode, and then that's it. I kind of wish that it would have done something different. Like maybe I kind of wish that this episode would have been more about her reluctance to change in her sentimental value or whatever that she has in her home, and that she wants to start a new life. I don't know. There's something there, but I don't know. But anyway, so Harold says like, oh, so death is one man and he's responsible for all the, like, one man like you and me, and he's responsible for everyone's death. And it's like, there's people die every day. How can one man be in all those places at once? And I thought that was kind of funny because that's just like the Santa argument. And everyone knows Santa's real. But again, I really like how calming Robert Redford is in this episode. He has just this very not authoritative. He has this very calm presence and very compassionate, really, in the performance. It's like he's so charming that the words that he says, some of the things that he says, like, how can one man be in all those places at once? He says that so genuinely and with such care in his voice for her, what is pretty much her delusion, that if he wasn't so charming, it would come across as slightly condescending, but it doesn't at all. And it's really good performance. So she then goes on to tell him about her history with death, and she tells the story about her being on a bus and seeing an old lady knitting in front of her a long time ago, and then a young man got on the bus and sat beside the woman knitting, despite there being empty seats. He didn't say anything, but she says that his presence upset the woman in the seat. And when she dropped the yarn, his fingers touched hers when he picked it up for her. And then he got off the bus, and then the woman died. So there's a lot of detail there that I feel is pretty interesting, and it's conveyed very well by Gladys Cooper. And I like that as like a singular anecdote, because then she goes on to say she's seen the man over the years, and he appeared whenever someone close to her died, and that she's the only one who could see him. And she's seen him in crowds, and once she saw him as a soldier, as a salesman, as a taxi driver. Basically, she's seen death in places where you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for him. And she goes on to say that she was, like I said, she was the only one that could see him, and that she could see clearer than the younger people could, and that it was because she was getting old and her time was coming. And she also says that his face is always different, and she can never be sure when Robert Redford kind of challenges her for that. And it's really depressing because he says, like, well, can he get you when you go outside? If he can be anyone, he can be anyone. And she says that she hasn't been outside for years. And again, COVID lockdown, like it resonates in a certain way these days. But she says that, like, they have this back and forth where he's like, well, what kind of life is that? Like you can't be living a fulfilling life by just staying inside and everything. And she says, if I don't live like this, I won't live at all. And at that moment, I was like, oh, I bet Robert Redford's death. I bet that he is death in this episode. And again, this depressing aspect comes into play because she starts wistfully remembering what it was like when she was young and saying that she was young once. She loved doing outdoor things. People said that I was pretty and that being outside would ruin my complexion and everything, but I always loved being outdoors and doing outdoor things. And I don't know, just that bitterness mixed with the wistful memory is so depressing to me. Because then she goes and says, I've always hated the dark and the cold. I'm old. I've lived a long time, but I don't want to die. And I would rather live in the dark than not live at all. And it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking and depressing and sad. Because she is resigning herself to a life that's not that great, that doesn't have like any worthwhile aspects to it, specifically because she does not want to die. And that's where I think the theme of the episode is really pretty strong, in that it's about the fear of the unknown, the fear of moving on and everything. It's in this kind of complacency with how things are, I guess, in a certain read of it. But yeah, it kind of just seems so depressing to me. It kind of seems like kind of in the macro of it is that, like, if we let our fears and anxieties dictate our life, is our life actually worthwhile? Which again is a very nihilistic and sad and depressing kind of viewpoint. But it is I kind of feel like this episode could have been, or would have been, maybe a bit stronger if the central character, if Wanda was a younger woman and the entire theme of the episode was her shielding herself from death, and then coming out the other side by being kind of not as worried about death and choosing to live her life. I think that would have been a more powerful episode. But in any case, it was still pretty good. This was still a pretty good episode. So then after this, we get, she sees someone at the door, and then there's a knock at the door. Harold kind of nods at her to go answer it. And I found that to be kind of interesting because he's kind of, in a sense, he's kind of coercing her to open the door. And even with the knowledge that he is death, it's not a malicious thing. It's all in service of making her understand and feel more comfortable. And I find that to be really interesting. So the man is the contractor who says that he's got his orders. I can't fool around any longer. And then he just bursts through the door, breaking the chain and everything, which at first I thought, holy crap, that's pretty intense. But then he goes on to explain that, they're an hour away from demolishing the building. So then that's a piece of dramatic, a bit of a dramatic moment, because when he bursts through the door, she collapses onto the ground. And the man comes in, kind of puts his head on her head, or hand on her head or neck, and then it cuts to a commercial. And so, like, I thought for a second, I was like, I wonder if she's dead. Like, what if he's death and he just killed her by touching her? And obviously that wasn't the case, but I thought it would be an interesting change up. I have no idea how it would have played out or anything, but anyway. So the contractor has put her in the bed and wakes her up, and he's rubbing her hand. And she wakes up and says, "And still I live." Kind of dramatically, like she's a little obsessed with age and her mortality and everything, which is fine. But there's a car honking outside. Like, really honking. Okay, anyway. So when she looks at him and the camera cuts back to him, his smile looks slightly intense. Like, the camera kind of lingers on him for half a beat too long. And I feel like it shows us her perspective of the contractor and of people in general. Like, she's fearful and everything. This is still honking. What the hell? Okay, the honking has stopped. So anyway, he says that he is there to demolish the building and that the building is old and dangerous and it has to come down to make room for a new one. And that's a pretty clear metaphor for aging and mortality. And he even kind of puts a button on that by saying that that's life, lady. And while he's explaining it, while he's saying these words, she is literally behind bars on her bed. And I just think that that's pretty interesting. So as he's going through that monologue about how the building is old and dangerous and it has to come down, that's also kind of a bleak kind of ageism kind of thing. Like, because it's a metaphor for humans, really. Like the contractor is kind of the human embodiment of death. Like, it's a human metaphor for death, because he is there to take away old, decrepit buildings so that they can make room for new ones. So I don't know. I thought that was kind of a weird connection, but he then kind of says, well, people think I'm a destroyer, but I'm actually helping improve the world and everything. And that kind of, again, seems like the human counterpoint to death with a capital D. And I also found that was kind of an interesting way to further lull her into understanding what's to come, in a certain sense. Yeah. So anyway, so he goes on to say that when a tree falls, another one comes up and sprouts from the ground in the same spot. And again, bleak and depressing, because that's clearly a metaphor for, reproduction and procreating. And presumably Wanda has no children. So it's even more bleak and depressing that her life has been spent evading death, and she hasn't lived because she's in constant fear of dying, and presumably she does not have any family to remember her after she dies. And I just feel like that in and of itself is a criticism that I have for the episode. Like, that is an actual issue that I have with the episode, is that we don't get any indication of what her life is up until that point, except for the memory of her loving being outdoors. And I kind of wish that there was a little bit more to her than what we get. So at this point, I thought, oh, Harold is kind of just not doing anything in this scene. The contractor's just kind of saying his whole piece and everything, and the camera is clearly not showing us Harold's space in the room. And in my notes I have, because he's death and the demo man can't see him. And then immediately I was like, I knew it. Because he can't see him and Harold is death. And I kind of wish that if they were going to conceal that a little bit better, I think that would be a little more, it would have been a little better if they worked to conceal that a little bit harder. Like, show, I don't know, have Harold fall asleep or something. I don't know. But, yeah. So I want to kind of just break away from this a little bit and talk about, again, another bleak and depressing aspect of this. And that bleak and depressing aspect is the contractor's perspective on the entire episode. That's another angle of the episode that is bleak and depressing. So he's paid to do a job, to demolish a building. He knows that there is a sole, old, reclusive woman staying there who has refused to vacate the premises. And before getting the police involved, he tries to get her to leave, an hour before demolition. He tries to get her to leave, presumably because he doesn't want to cause any trouble for her. And when he comes to get her out on demolition day, she's still unwilling, but then she speaks to an empty bed and tells the contractor that Mr. Belden is a policeman, which means nothing to the contractor. And then, like, just the thought of after, like, I'm thinking about, like, after the episode. After the episode, presumably the contractor goes back to her apartment with the police, presumably, and comes back to find her dead body in bed. And I don't know, it just seems like so depressing to think about that from the contractor's point of view, that this old woman dies moments before her home is condemned and demolished and everything. And the last interaction she has with another human being is this man trying to get her to leave. It just seems just so dark and depressing. Yeah. But anyway, so the contractor leaves and Wanda asks why Harold didn't help her. And that's when she realizes that he's death, and he says, "Look in the mirror, Wanda," which I thought was a very nice touch, because that's the first time he or anyone in the episode says her name. And I felt like that was a really good reveal, and I really liked how it was foreshadowed in Rod Serling's opening narration, because in his opening narration, he's looking in the mirror, and the camera is kind of focused on the reflection in the mirror, and then it zooms out or pans over to see that we're actually seeing a reflection, because he's like looking off to the side. So I like how that was kind of good foreshadowing for the reveal. So he's not in the reflection, and Wanda says, "You tricked me. It was you all the time." And she asks him why, and why was he nice to her, and why, like she said that the moment you came in, you could have taken me, but you were nice. You made me trust you. Why? And I really, again, Robert Redford as Harold / Death, he is so compassionate in his performance here that I find it really, really compelling. So he tells her that he had to make her understand. And then he goes on to say, like, "Am I really so bad? Am I really so frightening?" Which felt like he was gaslighting her in a sense. But then right after that, he's like, "The running's over. It's time to rest." And that, like, calming and soothing way that he plays the role is just so satisfying, and makes it's so comforting. And I really like that, because that's kind of the whole point of the episode, is the comfort of death, and death as a vessel for the afterlife instead of a Grim Reaper. It's just, and it's because of his performance, and in the way that he gives those lines, and the way that he performs those lines in this role. It doesn't feel like gaslighting. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It doesn't feel malicious. It just feels very natural, very calming and protective in a sense. Yeah, so I really liked it. So she's still resistant and says, "I don't want to die." And all he says is, "Trust me." And then this is something I found interesting. He says, "Mother, give me your hand," which I don't understand fully. Like, I really don't understand the significance of him calling her mother. I thought for a moment, like, maybe this iteration of death was meant to represent a son that she had. But I couldn't detect anything else in the episode to kind of pick up on that. So what I kind of landed on is I feel like it was maybe a term of endearment. Because he's death, he's eternal. But when addressing Wanda, he does so by referring to her as mother, as someone in, like, authority, or referring to her as his elder. I kind of feel like that's what the episode was getting at. That's what the meaning behind him calling her mother was. I could be wrong. If you know, please let me know. But I kind of feel like that's a sign of respect and a term of endearment, to kind of show that he also kind of giving control to her. Like, he is, it's up to her to whether or not to take his hand and to die, and that she's in control. So I don't know. I think that there's something there, but she takes his hand, and again, he's so calming and reassuring. He says, "See, no shock, no engulfment, no tearing asunder." And I love this kind of final line that she says, to him. She says, "What will happen? When will we go?" And again, I said this when I talked about the Passersby episode, but this gave me very, very strong vibes of Lost's series finale, which plays with a lot of these same concepts and everything, and is just a beautifully well done piece of television. Lost's series finale is phenomenal. I will stand by it until the day that Robert Redford asks me to take his hand. So as bleak and depressing and sad as this episode has been for me, I really love this moment for her, because she asks, what will happen? When will we go? And he just motions for her to look at the bed, and she looks over, sees herself laying peacefully with her hands on her, across her stomach or chest, and it's clear that she's dead. And he says, we've already begun. And like that, I just love that, especially with Robert Redford doing this whole compassionate performance. It's absolutely beautiful, really. So it kind of comes around. I kind of come around to it because not that I found that bleakness that, by all accounts, I could have been putting into the episode myself. It could be maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the counter of that, the kind of positive, upbeat energy of that she's going to have a fruitful afterlife, is pretty satisfying. So then they walk out the door, and we see them kind of walking across the street or the sidewalk, and they're talking pleasantly. And I think that was a really nice image to end on. And then we get the closing narration from Rod Serling, which I will play right now.
There was an old woman who lived in a room, and like all of us was frightened of the dark, but who discovered in a minute last fragment of her life that there was nothing in the dark that wasn't there when the lights were on. Object lesson for the more frightened amongst us, in or out of the Twilight Zone.
All right, and yeah, so that is Nothing in the Dark. Overall, it was okay. My initial response was that it was okay, and it felt kind of like a rehash of The Passersby, except instead of revenge, it's this fear of dying that permeates throughout the episode. And again, it was very bleak in a certain sense, that she's lived her life fearing the unknown and fearing death. And it's resulted in her being a recluse and distrustful of other people. And I found it just a little depressing to think that she missed out on years of happiness because she was afraid of dying. But it does end in an uplifting fashion with her. Despite her spending her twilight years running from death, she now has found peace in the afterlife, which is reassuring and positive and everything. But also, I do just kind of wish that we had a little bit more detail about her life and who she was, because without, like, we get the one little monologue about her, her youth, and how she was, people said that she was beautiful and that she loved being outdoors and doing things outdoors and everything. That's fine, but I kind of wish that there was, given that the contractor goes on this whole monologue about destroying the old and bringing out the new and building new on top of it and everything, seems like it's such a clear metaphor for procreation and leaving behind, relatives and children and everything to remember you and like share your legacy and everything. We don't have any knowledge of her in that respect, so it kind of seems like a little bit of an empty metaphor there that isn't completely connected. But overall, I thought that Nothing in the Dark was very solid. I enjoyed it. I thought that the performances were what really made it for me, and that by all accounts positive ending was really much more satisfying than I expected it to be, given how bleak and dark I found most of the subtext in the episode to be. So yeah, so that is my review of Nothing in the Dark. let me know what you thought of this episode. And again, check out patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. I am going to now round out this episode of Anthology with a bonus review, non-spoiler of course, of Dead Storage from Science Fiction Theater Season 1. So I'm going to play the music now. Dead Storage aired on October 8th, 1955, and the plot summary, courtesy of IMDb, is Arctic workers discover a frozen mammoth which is quickly transported to a research institute. Upon thawing and with a little galvanic shock, investigations take an interesting turn. This episode was directed by Jack Herzberg and written by Stuart Jerome, with a story by credit by Ivan Tors, and it stars Virginia Bruce, Walter Coy, and Robert H. Harris. So as is usually the case with science fiction theater, it begins with a pre-show kind of scientific experiment or demonstration, I should say, in which this episode, Truman Bradley shows us this frozen fish, this fish that is encased in a block of ice, and he says that, all of its cells are dead, and by all accounts, in terms of science, it is dead. And then he puts it into water, it thaws, and then it swims out. And so he then does another demonstration talking about, well, I don't remember exactly what he said, but they're like, not fruit flies, but they're like, water tigers or something. They're like little insects that live in lakes, and they're dependent on water. They need to be submerged in water. And if the lakes dry out, or if a lake dries out, they die. But if it fills with water again, they come back to life or something. And all of that's getting at the concept of suspended animation. And that's the theme of our episode. He says that's the theme of the story we're going to tell you tonight. And then we get into the episode, and I will say that I do believe that this is available. I do have a link in the show notes of this episode for it. By the way, I'll probably put pictures of that H.G. Wells collection in the show notes of the episode, so check that out, because I just think it looks so cool. I'm looking at it on my table right next to me. Anyway, so this episode of Science Fiction Theater was okay. It was a little bit lacking for me. It did have... The beginning part of the episode is very much contingent on the mystery of the quote-unquote frozen, the frozen quote-unquote specimen that's discovered. And it's not until they bring it to get it thawed out and everything that we are shown that it is a mammoth, which is pretty satisfying. It's pretty cool because it is a massive animal. And they must be, they must have some kind of, they must have had some, not issues shooting it, but I can't imagine how much of a production that was to have a mammoth in it, or an elephant in it in the episode. Which also, Twilight Zone ended up doing that in 1960 with A World of His Own, I think. Yeah. I always get that confused with A World of Difference. Anyway, from season 1. So, overall, this episode's kind of dry. They thaw out the mammoth, and then they're surprised that it's alive and everything. So it was in suspended animation. They run some tests, which obviously, that's one of the things I really like about this show, is that it does take this scientific approach to it. Even if the science is 1955 science, it's still really satisfying to have this kind of science-centric sci-fi anthology show at the helm, at the forefront, with science at the forefront. But it kind of seems like this episode is less about the kind of science aspect of it, and more about the human storytelling that they're doing, like the human connections they're doing, which is by all accounts just okay. There are these two doctors that are brought in, these two scientists, Dr. Griffin and I can't remember the guy's name, but Dr. Griffin is a woman, and it's kind of funny, I guess, in a very dated way, that the end of like when someone's like, well, we can bring in Dr. Griffin, how do you feel about her? And then one guy's like, well, women scientists, even with that, she's still pretty good, or she's still the best in her field. It's like, okay, thanks, 1955. But she is a respected scientist in the episode. And then she's partnered with this journalist who everyone kind of has this preconceived idea about, that, oh, he's just a journalist who's going to come water down all of their research and everything, boil it down to a sensationalist article, and it's not going to advance science or anything. And then he's like, no, I actually have a PhD. I want to share science stuff and everything. So, don't count your mammoths before they thaw, I guess. Anyway, so I'm not going to give much away, but there is a piece of Dr. Griffin's backstory that's revealed kind of later in the episode, how she experienced tragedy. Like she had a loss in her family. And I kind of find it interesting that the episode does kind of play with her using the mammoth as a replacement for that, or maybe not replacement. Replacement is way too harsh of a word, but she connects with the mammoth because she has experienced loss and everything in her life, and it's 1955, so maybe there's a maternal kind of connection there that they're painting at there. But it's fine. It's not like obtrusive or anything, but I do find it pretty, I found that I latched onto that a little bit better than pretty much anything else in the episode. And something, I do feel like this is one of the weaker written episodes of science fiction theater that I've seen so far, specifically because it is very much, I don't know, it felt very hurried. It felt like in the third act, they basically, and this is also probably a production issue. Like they couldn't actually do this, like the things that that the story commanded, in terms of in camera. But basically the third act opens with them transporting the mammoth to a different location. And then we get Truman Bradley narrating, as he does after every commercial. He narrates and gives like an update and everything. But to usher us into the third act, he says like, well, the journalist guy was driving and following the route that the mammoth was being transported on, and he saw evidence of an accident and went back and they found Toby the mammoth, and they found Dr. Griffin and everything. And it was just like, okay, like that just felt like, it felt like those like old silent films that have like missing reels, and that they would have to like one of the first Akira Kurosawa movies has like footage missing from it. So like if you watch it on DVD or wherever, or on Criterion Channel, it like says like there's an entire arc in the movie that's missing because the footage doesn't exist anymore. So it has like a black screen, and it gives an update like, oh, at this point we're doing this, this character is doing this now. And that's what this felt like. That's what this felt like. It just felt like it was very much bringing us up to speed on something that happened off screen, and is arguably, or not arguably, the most thrilling aspect of the episode, or the biggest moment of the episode. But I don't know. The other thing that I kind of had an issue with was, again, this is a pretty slight episode. It's a pretty lacking episode for me. And it ends on this just really silly, like 50s kind of man and woman kind of thing. Like, I guess I'll kind of spoil it. It's just like, oh, well, you know, we learned this lesson, and I think that we can both agree that we should go on a date. It's just very like, okay, whatever. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that I felt like I do like the idea of the suspended animation and the way that things are frozen in time. Obviously, it was done very well with the first Jurassic Park. I thought that was the best utilization of that. Even though that's not even suspended animation now that I think about it. They just tapped maple trees to get dinosaur blood from mosquitoes. So anyway, it kind of felt like a little bit of a precursor for Jurassic Park, I guess, but I don't think Michael Crichton drew any inspiration from this. I think that just the overall concept of suspended animation and genetic mutation and genetic engineering and stuff was a hot button issue at the time and throughout all of science fiction. So anyway, I guess those are my thoughts on Dead Storage from Science Fiction Theater Season 1. If you watched that episode, let me know what you thought. I do say that there are much better episodes out there of science fiction theater. So, okay, that should just about do it for this episode of Anthology. I do want to say, I forgot to mention this at the top, but I do apologize for the lateness of this. I've been trying to release these episodes weekly, but I just got kind of bogged down with some stuff and everything. So my apologies, but I am still at it. I'm still going to pump out episodes as frequently as I can, and I hope you guys are enjoying them. Next week on the podcast, we are going to do episode 81, One More Pallbearer, from Twilight Zone Season 3, and Science Fiction Theater Season 1, Episode 25, The Human Equation. So look forward to that. I'm going to start playing myself out, but I do want to say thank you guys so much for listening and for supporting me and everything. Check out Patreon, patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. Also, in the realm of science fiction and everything, check out my review with Tiny of Nope, Jordan Peele's new movie, which I thought was excellent, over on Obsessive Viewer, on the Obsessive Viewer podcast. And I also wrote a review on obsessiveviewer.com. And thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. And now, here's a short clip from our Patreon exclusive RSS feed. To hear the full clip and more exclusive Patreon content, go to patreon.com/obsessiveviewer and become a patron at the minimum rate of $1 per month. Thank you and enjoy. You do feel, or I did feel, a sense of sadness when her resignation request was denied, because she was just so hopeful. She was so sure. And that is something I find just really, really curious, because we don't know if the resignation requests are sent out or aren't sent out. We don't know if we don't know. My estimation, or my guess, is that they're not, and that Lumen is just controlling them, and that they are their prisoners, basically. But the other kind of darker aspect of that is, what if they are sent out? And the psychological effect of her resignation request getting denied is pretty big, because we have this individual who is so certain she knows herself. She's so certain that she knows that her outside self, that the version of her that is outside of work, will hear her request to resign from the company and recognize that it is her making that choice and would honor that choice. And then to have that just completely deflated and not taken is really, really psychologically demoralizing. And it's really interesting because I think that it will have far-reaching effects for Helly, maybe, because it is something that is, like I said, demoralizing. It's a way to beat her down. It is a way to beat her down and make her become more supplicant and more work focused and everything, because that is literally her entire existence in Lumen.
This podcast was edited and produced by Matt Hurt and presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. You can find links to all of our shows at ObsessiveViewer.com/podcasts. For exclusive bonus content, including reviews, commentaries, and B-roll episodes, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.